And maybe you could begin by talking about the origins of the project, how you began to work in Falfurrias and your relationship to the center and the different players, and then your relationship among the three of you in terms of your practice.
Yes, definitely. So the project is named Cenote. It takes from this text from Gloria Anzaldúa that she writes about a cenote or sonot is from the Yucatec Mayan language, which means land location with accessible groundwater. And it's sort of like a inner stream of conscious and dream pool. So how we see this is a sort of residency, an artist or micro residency / artist collective that has evolved over time, and each of us have a relationship with the landscape of South Texas, but also the borderland in general, the U.S.-Mexico borderland. So I personally began working down there a couple of years ago through various friends of mine that live in the area, and I kind of just joined them to sort of see what projects they're doing. This was back in maybe 2016, 2015, 2016. Sorry, I'm going to introduce myself really quickly. So I'm Angel. And then we have Tere Garcia, who's also an artist and does a lot of work in photography and installation. Tere, you want to introduce yourself too?
Yes, my name is Tere Garcia, and I'm originally from Mexico, but I immigrated to the United States around 20 years ago. And my first point of entry was McAllen, Texas, where I stayed there for a couple of years. My sister, she decided to stay in the border town. And my family, my mother, my brother, and I, we moved back to Houston to pursue our education. And then from there, I moved to New York, and then kind of like the whole cycle began again because now I'm working in the South Texas borderlands again. So that's what my work is being developing from the past 3 to 4 years now, where I go to this border, especially South Texas border, and survey and research these areas or these places. Like for me, it exists as a barrier because I'm DACA. I haven't been able to cross to my country since then. So for me, it's kind of like, okay, I'm researching this area where it's kind of like my stopping point. This is kind of like the barrier that is dividing me to going back to my own country. And this is actually where I created most of my work, where I basically began to build my studio in these landscapes, in these borderlands.
Okay, and I guess I'll go next. My name's Matt Flores. I'm originally from around the Corpus Christi area, between Mathis and the outside of Corpus. I'm a writer, and I'm currently living in Tempe, Arizona, doing my MFA in poetry out here. I spent most of my life in the South Texas region, and what initially drew me to Falfurrias and doing some of the humanitarian work there with the South Texas Human Rights Center was, well, it's always been like present in the news in South Texas. Like everyone is aware of it, but it's almost like at the periphery. And so recently, when I'd been going back down to visit home, when I was doing my undergrad at University of Houston, I just find myself kind of being around home, and I just wanted to get more involved and, in a sense, like make a new kind of like residence, or like be a part of a new kind of residence down there in Falfurrias. So I got started working there, volunteering with Canales, and then me and Angel eventually went down together and with Tere too, and had the idea of developing these micro residencies for El Cenote. And so my approach to this residency and being down there is like very much inflected by my poetry and like lyrical thinking, and specifically in
Did we lose him?
Yes, I think we did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Matt, maybe we can go back.
Frequency out. That's what el cenote is.
Nos está llevando a otra dimensión.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah,
have
so-
up on my computer is the very interesting drawing that shows the sort of the thinking around the cenote that was part of your project, because it has a kind of topography that I think is speaks to the ways in which the three of you are thinking, as Matt just said, through lyrical thinking, visual thinking, and then activism, right?
Yes.
The fact that you're citing Gloria Anzaldua's idea about the cenote as this kind of undercurrent that deals with both healing and art practices might speak to your various practices, which are very different, but that come together in this one place, and which is why I think the residency has, it's a kind of site for conversations and bringing different perspectives as to how this particular place, which with its brutal histories, can raise consciousness and lead others into activism as well.
Yeah, when that drawing that you're talking about, it was sort of my way of mapping out like these various like branches. And yeah, when you think about a cenote, which is a sinkhole that's usually found in the Yucatan Peninsula, that originates from this sort of underground crater as well. Like it's almost like this cosmic entity that made cenotes in the Yucatan Peninsula in the Mexican region. So when I was mapping out this drawing, I was thinking, I was thinking of like this, I don't know if you guys know of like the eugenics graphic, like where's the tree and all these branches. I've worked with that image, trying to invert that image as well, sort of critiquing like the sort of like interdisciplinary of science, but it was an inspiration of how I created that drawing. It was sort of similar to branching out, and there's text, you know, there's the writer, there's the activist, but also the curandero, the organizer, and even land, like landscape, limestone, and water. Water is an important part in this project as well. So I saw it as a land sculpture, but like also in Joseph Beuys's terms, like a social sculpture that is built by a collective hand. And so that is the sort of mapping or the geography of El Cenote, located in Falfurrias, Texas, and the surrounding landscape of Falfurrias, which ties in a lot of things like Tere's work, Matt as a writer, and also the community that we've been engaging with in the area, such as the South Texas Human Rights Center, who's dedicated in preventing migrant deaths within the area through the water station project as well. But also thinking about like the archaeology of the site as well. So thinking about the sort of history of Falfurrias, like the sort of local curandero legend of Don Pedro Jaramillo as well. And Don Pedro Jaramillo used the element of water as a source of healing as well, which are still told within the local residents of Falfurrias as the stories of Don Pedro Jaramillo. So water as well plays sort of an archaeological element, but as well as like something that's being used right now. And so it made me think of El Cenote, which is a sort of collective of groundwater, which I see all of our work coming together in this sort of mesh way.
So I'll introduce myself and just say I'm Roberto Tejada. I'm a writer, poet, art historian, and I am faculty at the University of Houston. But picking up on that, Angel, maybe you could say something about, because it's very interesting that the fact that Don Pedro Jaramillo is this turn of the 20th century healer. So it kind of ties into a long-standing healing practices, devotional practices that are tied to the land, right? And maybe you could say something about that and how you see this as related to the current political situation, the kind of, and every day I'm speaking to you from McAllen, which is the first time I've done this particular city with Reynosa. I know the other ones, many of the other ones in Texas and in California. But the debate at this particular moment, as you know, has been hijacked in a particular way. And so maybe you could talk about how that links to your project as well, and your various art practices.
Yeah. Well, I'll begin by sort of continuing how I started being involved with the area. One of my grandfather's brother disappeared in an attempt to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. And so it's this thing that has been in our family of like a family member that has disappeared, and we have no way of like getting in a contact or like a sort of like a life and death kind of conclusion. And so it sort of called me to come to Falfurrias in this area, which is very close to the border. And I started visiting various burial sites, historical burial sites, cemeteries. For one example is where Don Pedro Jaramillo is buried as well. It's also a cemetery. But also some of the more recent forensic burial exhumations that have been happening, and that gave me interest in studying the processes of the forensic anthropologists that were going down there and exhuming the burials there and the unidentified migrant remains. So I went and I trained in what forensic anthropologists, the process of doing all that. And that was sort of an eye-opening for me to see the body in relationship with the land, but in a very like, very, in the situation that's going on right now. And that's what kind of tied me to this work, thinking about the archaeology, like Don Pedro Jaramillo, who's, we think of it as like, a ways off time, but also the sort of forensic element of the land. And for me, it was interesting to kind of figure out that line of what is considered historical and archaeological and forensic, and those things kind of come together with this project. Yeah.
How about you, Tere and Matt?
I think for me, it was a way of healing, because it took me a while to go back to McAllen, Texas. After I received DACA, it was almost probably 10 to 12 years where I was not able to go back to the border or cross these checkpoints. So when I first got the DACA permit, my first instinct was to go back to where I started my journey, which was McAllen, Texas. I went there, I began to study the borderlands. I would drive all the military highway, kind of like seeing these landscapes, kind of like seeing how the architecture of this wall, which I feel it becomes like this type of monument that is being built to create fear to others. And then from there, my practice has been photo-based. I have a master's degree in photography. And then I decided to start working with a very basic material, which is a light-sensitive paper, the paper that you use in that room to fixate an image. But instead, I began to use the paper and intertwine the paper into the fence, or washing the paper into the river, into the Rio Grande, kind of like as a representation or a way of healing. So for me, it was like weaving the paper into the fence, where it's going in Mexico and United States. It's kind of like traveling into both directions. So for me, it was like, this is a way of seeing a landscape and uses this paper, that it becomes actually like two cultures, two languages, two different identities. And at the same time, it was very performative as well, thinking that it was like I was the paper and I was the one going into these two into these two places, existing into both places. And at the end, retrieving the paper and not fixating the paper, because usually you bring this paper into a dark room, use chemicals, developer fixer, and then you have an image that it lasts. For instance, the way that I use is retrieve the paper and just let the natural, just leave the paper continue developing on their own natural way until somehow the image is going to be erased. In a way, it's kind of like a metaphor for me to think about how these images or how these places, how these monuments can be erased in the future. So in that particular project, I called the Anti-Monument Project, in a way of fighting against these structures that have been built to separate and to create fear into these towns, into society in general. It was, for me, was even interesting, like being there, knowing that I was really putting myself into these situations and confronting these border patrols, knowing that at any point they would just come to me and ask for my identity, and being able, like, okay, what are you doing here? We can send you back to your own country. But instead, I just decided to confront these places, to kind of like heal with myself, being able to be there and reclaim my space to, like, this is the land that belongs to everyone. This is not a land that is just because there's a fence. It belongs to this part. It belongs to United States, or it belongs to Mexico. The land is the land that it should belong to everyone in general.
It sounds like it's a technique also to refute the methods of fear and terrorizing and militarizing that take place on the border, just your physical presence.
Definitely. And at some point it was very interesting to know that I was being, like, I was almost performing for these surveillances. As soon as I stop into these places, helicopters, cars will stop by, people like border patrol will start harassing me and asking me questions of why I was doing in these areas. And I was always explaining them what I was doing in the border, and the fence. And then from there, I began to create a different type of body of work, which, well, I began to do a voluntary service for the South Texas Human Rights Center, where we were doing the water drops, living water around the desert in Bruce County. And then I began to collect objects that were left behind by migrants, like close to this desert, and collecting them. And then I began to create a new piece where I place the actual, I'm using again licensed city paper. I cut pieces of licensed city paper and place them around the desert where I know where there's traces where the immigrants cross through the fence, and create like this type of ritual where I put the licensed city paper, the objects on top of them, and let them be scattered around the desert and being exposed by the sun. And again, I retrieve the images, I retrieve the object, and the paper only becomes something that is not permanent, but it's something that it will disappear as well. The images are very abstract. They're not very representational, because I don't think I'm interested in presenting the actual object, but what the paper really captures, or what the paper really absorbs. It absorbed most of the paper of the objects were wet. There could be urine, there could be any fluids that the body have when the migrants left their objects behind. So for me, it was most important to kind of like recollect those traces left behind with these objects.
How about you,
I don't know
Matt?
if somebody wants to jump in too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say, and definitely, like, my trajectory is very similar to, sorry, noise behind me.
No, I love it.
In really, like, kind of carrying on this really old tradition of healing. So being down there in South Texas with the land has really, like, reinvigorated that for me, because I mean, for instance, I grew up around the Corpus Christi area, and I had never heard of Gloria Anzaldúa or a lot of like Chicana writers who like very much now are like the foundation of like my artistic practice. So returning there again and working with South Texas Human Rights Center, I really try to incorporate their work because I mean it is healing centered, along with the work of like the curanderos and curanderas in the area too, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is like being from that land, we've kind of found our own ways to make healing on our own, like whether that's through the collection of specific herbs in the area, or through preserving our own history through like say the corridos, for example, or play too, and just how to like celebrate one another. Those have been like really important things in returning to the land and trying to like bring into El Cenote. So foremost though, it's about like community and being with Angel and Tere down there. We are very much like working together and trying to like, I don't know, not just preserve a history that's not frequently retold, but also to like anticipate a new one in a way that's not being displayed by say, like law enforcement or like political organizations, or just like the Texas educational system, for example.
Matt, maybe you could say something about your concrete relationship to Angel's work, because there's a writing project that comes out of a conversation with each other's work. And maybe Angel, you could say something about how that developed as well. And probably now, Tere, that you've probably seen some of those text image works, and think about how your photo-based practice also ties into that.
Yeah, I think this project was kind of was pretty launched with me and Matt visiting Falfurrias and the South Texas Human Rights Center. I have a very particular interest in land, but in a very specific way. I'm starting to realize that I have this interest in archaeology and what that is, or this idea of how we perceive history, but through like a queer and trans archaeology, like queer trans archaeology as a term itself. So I identify as an artist, even though I've done like training in forensic anthropology and or worked sort of like this organizer, helper at the South Texas Human Rights Center. But I first come as an artist. So one of the main things that we sort of were thinking about with the El Cenote is how we can bring people into the site, because when you think about a lot of border land work or the landscapes of the borderland, it's always presented in a very in a very institutional gallery, very sterilized space. And so one of the things about me that I thought was pretty impactful is actually going down there and being hands-on with the community, but also as well as the land. Because once you get down there, everything changes. Like your perspectives change on what is going on, and you realize a lot of things. The Borderlands is a very interesting space.
Could you describe that? Sorry to interrupt, but because I agree with you 100. I mean, this is like, I think for those who don't know the Valley and this part of South Texas, how would you describe that difference?
Yeah, well, I'm from Houston. I was born and raised in Houston, so I'm not originally from South Texas or the Valley. But of course, I've heard of it or whatever, right? We go down there. There are Tejano radio stations, right? Here in Houston, Kakukuka was probably like one of the last ones here that existed, and that was in the 90s. But even the sounds change when you're down there. I mean, of course, there's a lot of different types of play. It's a board game. The Borderland is a board game, and everyone's playing a role. That has been sort of constructed for lots of decades, and a lot of people don't realize that You know, there's a lot of underground economies. There's a lot of tension there, and you feel it when you're down there. You know, when you're down there, you see a water station, and then you also see a border patrol like car, and then you see like a private ranch. So there's a lot of stakes in the land that are sort of established, and it's very tense for a person that's barely, you know, coming from the outside. And so I thought that was pretty interesting and important, to bring people into this site. That's how we see El Cenote. El Cenote, we sort of, you know, when you think of El Cenote, it was as well a sort of sacrificial, like ceremonial site as well. Just throw things in. So that's how we're kind of treating this piece, this sculpture piece, is that we just sort of diving in as a sort of sacrificial thing, and working with that, with the environment in South Texas. So I think that was an important realization that I had with the project.
I think
I don't know if that answers your.
No, that's really, I think this is the key question, and I think that's fascinating what you're saying. I mean, I think this idea of the board game, the different players, all the stakes that are involved, the built environment is so different from anything above, like any of the urban centers in
Exactly. Yeah.
You begin to just the forms of construction, the different economies as you've described it, are immediately noticeable in the visible and the palpable evidence.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Yes.
I think I even thought, well, my first impact was the Tejano Station, because it's one of my favorites. It brought me back to my childhood. I'm from Monterrey, Nuevo León, so I grew up listening to this music and driving this pickup truck in the landscapes of Falfurrias while listening to Tejano music and knowing most of the songs. I remember Angel and Mar were like, how do you know all of these songs that I grew up listening to these songs? For me, it was like, it almost felt like I was going back to my roots when I was in Falfurrias. But again, it's the dialogue that exists within the neighborhood. You begin to know everyone. You go to the library, you know the librarian. They're very open to tell you the stories of Falfurrias. Everybody have their own stories of Falfurrias. It's like a small town where everybody knows each other. And at the same time, it's a community too, that they help each other, that they embrace each other. But on the other side, there's this dark side of this town. When you begin to think about the residents began talking about stack houses, how there's houses in these environments where they're hiding human trafficking or immigrants and things like that. So it's kind of like just like what Angel says, it's like a board game. It's very difficult and it's very intriguing and interesting to be into these landscapes too. And actually, the way to create work, it shifts completely. Like for me, when I was there, I was 100% dedicated to do my humanitarian my humanitarian work. For me, I was 100% working into that, cutting grass, hurting my arms. For me, it was like, I love,
which is the water stations, right?
Which is the water station. It goes for me all the time. Was like, this is going beyond art. We're going beyond something else now. We're just shifting this idea of an artist, and now we're kind of like becoming these humanitarian people, like helping others to kind of like survive. And the narrative of other people that I'm never gonna forget, it was this person who works at one of the ranches, and that ranch is one of the most important one because that's where they drop most of the immigrants, so that way they can begin their journey. So one of the people who was working there, he says something like, yeah, este es el comienzo del infierno. Like, this is the beginning of hell. This is where hell is gonna begin for all of these migrants who's gonna continue this journey along the Brooks County, just to circumvent a checkpoint. And if we go into those details of the attention to deterrence or prevention to deterrence on how this checkpoint is being positioned or has been placed in a particular and a strategical area, to cause the death of the immigrants. It's another topic that it creates this whole
well, I think that's kind of important with your work, with the work that you say anti-monument, you know. I think, you know, you talked about how there's a lot of money being poured to establish these stations, right? And even the construction of like the wall and stuff, where it's a sort of it's an aesthetic construction. It's not really going to
change anything.
Yeah, it's not really doing what it's supposed to be doing. Like for instance, they change. There's constantly rotating border patrols. They have to rotate border patrols because there's corruption as well within the border patrol. So it's this involvement of that, and with your work, the anti-monument is sort of speaking as you sort of creating your process of creating your work is the monument. Like it's not this aesthetic construction where they're made to sort of basically like kill, you know? So I think that's super important in relating to your work, especially the anti-monument work that you're working on down there. But for me, I think, oh no, go ahead.
No, I was saying, like, carrying on what you were saying, like there's a lot of layers of everything going down there, as you're describing as like a board game. And to really, there's no really like getting beyond it, but when you're like being with the land and driving out in the ranches and this certain kind of like stillness, as I remember you described it before, Angel, it's just like very, it's just very strange. Like just, you don't hear anything, you're just in the brush in very like similar circumstances, but at the same time, not at all similar circumstances. I think at that point, that's when, I think when we best do our work, and when Tere was completing one of her lumen print works there, we were like out in the brush in the ranch. So yeah, getting out there and is like really the only way to go beyond like these layers that are presented to us. There's like the narratives of Border Patrol representing this, like the walls representing this, which really don't have any of the utility that they're being described as such.
Yeah, it's a very militarized area, you know, and that's also another thing that I've been sort of realize is the board game is, everyone is sort of playing this role as well, you know, the border patrol, the forensic anthropologist, right? It's and me in particular, I'm interested in the identity of what forensics, the process of forensics, because forensics is very tied with archaeology as well. So I'm interested in how forensics gets constructed that ties into law enforcement as well. Because the process of identifying human remains is very biological, is very essentialist, biological essentialist, right? It's very binary. And it's interesting as a trans person to sort of work with these processes of forensics as well. So my work usually uses those methods, but as well sort of critique them in a way where it sort of benefits this sort of gameplay down there, which is also very, I mean, yeah, like you said, it's very interesting and it's hard. It's you know, when you start pulling everything out, you start pulling, it's like a slime. You start taking everything out at the same time. So one of the important things is to bring other perspectives into this project. So that is perspective, Matt's perspective. I think the more perspectives that you have down there, the more you're able to sort of like detangle this thing of the Borderlands.
That I kind of I've been paying attention to when I'm collecting these items. I've been collecting these items close to the water stations, and Eric Canales, he's been collecting those items for me, and now I kind of like begin to be very something shift when I was in that area, because I'm very interested into the archaeological aspect of the objects, how these objects have been manipulated in order for these people to survive. they use these jackets and they readjust and they accommodate the jacket in a way where they build backpacks. So I kind of like imagine how the people are beginning to change their clothing in order to survive when they're going into these terrains. They readjust their shoes, they readjust their pants. There's a lot of modifications they create in the clothing too that is been drawing my attention a lot. It's like I say, being in there, it completely shift me from my way of working by analyzing and thinking about how people been using these objects to survive in these landscapes.
Do you
Angel,
want to say anything? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just curious if this idea of a queer trans archaeology and its particular relationship to the land, and the way you describe what you bring to the forensics. Are there any narratives now that you've been working there for several years that might illuminate how your actions there kind of I would imagine set off reactions, and that these form part of the narrative that you are jointly and collectively constructing together?
Yeah, it's been a challenging sort of way of working, especially like, I mean, just navigating a lot of different, there's a lot of homophobia, there's a lot of transphobia intersecting as well. And we rarely hear about the trans women that are in detention centers as well. So it's this thing that I'm barely scratching the surface. And I'm a one-person team as well. So it's been a long sort of research. But yes, one of the things that I've kind of sort of thought about the what you mentioned, the queer and trans archaeology, is how to sort of view forensics and archaeology in a way where, say, forensic is also a way of benefiting law enforcement and the advancements of science, which is a very essentialist sort of biological essentialist, and this has a lot to do again with the eugenics tree that I sort of talked about at the beginning, and me sort of reformulating the map of what you saw in the Cenote map. So archaeology as well. There's this book by Nadia Abu El Haj. It's called Facts on the Ground, and she talks a lot about how archaeology is used in Israeli society as a way to construct nationalist identity on Palestinian land. And I thought that was very interesting. I was like, wow, this is basically this is very similar to my practice that I've been doing in South Texas, but not just in South Texas, also sort of broadening the scope and thinking about indigenous archaeology as well, how it's used in national countries like Mexico. It's very similar how it's used to construct this sort of like nationalist identity of in Mexico as well, because nobody can own sort of archaeological objects. It's owned by the state. So that's also as well very interesting. And in tying it back to the forensics, how migrant remains are sort of used within this identity scope of not just a gender, a biological sex binary, but also very racialized as well. So these things are still being used. They're very tied to eugenics that have a long US history here as well. And so that has been a very challenging thing to work with because I don't consider myself a scientist, but a lot of my work is used a lot of performance work, and I use a lot of my recent work has a lot to do with using the nightclub as an environment, as an alternate space, similar to a courtroom where there is queer and trans testimony. And these materials that I use can be transformed in other ways that are not in that direction. So yes, there's a lot of things that I'm sort of working on right now. But I recently wrote my first essay called Science at the Club, Putrefaction as an Artistic Practice, which sort of explores all these ideas, South Texas landscape, queer and trans archaeology, and the nightclub space as a sort of performative site of this type of testimony. Yeah, I don't know if that answered anything.
No, it's interesting to use you're sort of disavowing your knowledge of science, but I would suggest that you are knowledgeable about science, but using the fiction that performance allows to underline the blind spots or the limits of science, right? Its limits and its more nefarious uses.
Yeah, that's interesting how you say fiction, which is that it's very interesting with connecting to my work, because a lot of my pieces actually use scientific methods and processes like the Petri dish or DNA extraction. So it's like literally using these processes, but the context is where I present them is what changes the meaning of these processes. So the context, the space, the environment, it's almost gives the meaning to these things. And for me, it's very similar to a landscape. The landscape, in archaeology, you have the context can be destroyed. So to excavate is to destroy. That's a saying in archaeology. If you want to excavate, you're destroying the context, you're destroying the landscape as well, and you're altering what you're trying to get to. So that is something that I always constantly think about, especially when this project Cenote down in South Texas is sort of like this alternate way of viewing, like queer and trans archaeology, but bringing other artists as well, like Tere Garcia's work and Matt Flores' writing, and other artists that we're going to be working with in the near future to bring them into the space and think about those things in those kind of ways.
Yeah, I wonder what each of you, I guess maybe the way to ask this is, at the end of the day, what troubles you most about this kind of work? Which is also a way of asking, what is it you would desire for artists and thinkers and writers who may visit Falfurrias to come away with? In other words, what can be gained by actually spending time in this very particular space?
It's a very loaded question.
Yeah. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I think we were talking about it earlier, just like just being with the land, getting there is just like what you were saying too, Roberto, was like, I mean, you have to be there. It's just such a different place than anywhere up like around Houston or North Texas. But it's just, it's loaded, I think, in the sense that there's so much going on there. I mean, just going to HEB, for example, you're gonna get stories from people that work there, just telling you, they don't tell you everything, but they just like give you enough to like make you want more. So, I mean, you definitely learn the kind of like Tejano storytelling being there. And also like in a sense, history is like so preserved there because the land is so, the land itself for the most part, I think is like very much intact, like went out to the brush, which isn't the case for like many other areas too.
And I think it's to bring awareness to the land. You go there, it is such a beautiful landscape. You see a lot of different type of butterflies. You see this very beautiful landscape, the sounds, the different sounds that exist of the different type of everything. It's just the sounds are so poetic, but at the same time, when you're there, you know that you're in a massive grave. Well, there's a lot of immigrants that are probably dying around these landscapes. So I think it's something for us to be aware and to know what's really happening into these landscapes. As I'm talking in general as the Brooks County, where from January till now, it's been 40 people that already been found dead. And that's the only people who has been recorded. We don't really know the exact amount of people who have really died into this landscape. So for me, at some point, it's again to bring awareness of what's really happening, what a checkpoint is really causing this, how it's affecting these environments in general, like I said, the landscapes and humanity. So I think for my point of view is to bring awareness of what really happening in these areas, and what the government really causes to, like building this. They just built a new checkpoint that it costs millions of dollars. For which reason? For the reason of killing more people, because of course they're not going to go and kill the people. They're just leave them. Okay, go ahead, go to your journey, but you're going to die on your own. So what's happened is the American wash their hands and say it was their own decision to cross to this board through these landscapes. The landscapes are terrible. You're outside for 20 minutes and it's unbelievable. Every time I was doing the water drops, I couldn't understand how people were crossing, how people were walking in these landscapes. Of course, they were desperate. I saw bottles of baby bottles. I saw Pampers. I saw baby clothing. I was just imagining how at night, probably these landscapes become something that during the day, it's beautiful. Like it's so contradictory too. So for me, it's the awareness of the area.
I think for me is to sort of start thinking like how to perceive landscape in a different way, or land. You know, when you think of land as a very like physical material property, you know, that very often that's how white people see land, right? So it's a physical space for them, you know, and that's how material and property gets owned. And so a lot of what Cenote is trying to kind of think of land in these other spaces as well. I think that's also an important thing to that I want people involved with this piece to sort of take. Because Cenote doesn't have like a base. So it's in Falfurrias, it's in this area. But it doesn't have like a space. It's always sort of moving constantly, and it's different with each artist that we bring down there.
And it's kind of like not reclaiming ownership, or it's not reclaiming any land.
Yeah, and so we're kind of like shamans. We're kind of like curanderas, curanderos ourselves as well, and we're sort of constructing this sort of cenote, this portal in Falfurrias that doesn't stay within a physical legal property or ownership, that it can move and adapt. And that's how I kind of want to see a perspective in land in general, a sort of as well a spiritual perspective.
I mean, the contradictions that you are each outlining between the politics of deterrence, which has created this weaponized desert, and then the stories that one is only left to imagine of desperation that would lead peoples through the most inhospitable desert that also has its natural beauty, that inevitably leads to the thousands of deaths that have occurred just in the last 10 years, or in the last 15, 20 years, this century, of this particular kind of weaponizing of the landscape.
No, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think, yeah.
I guess one thing is it possible? How do we impact and create through expressive means ways in which viewers and readers come to that understanding of this contradiction that is taking place in in the terrain of Falfurrias and elsewhere in the valley?
I think it's what we sort of propose is to, I think it requires them to be there and to be present in there. I think for me, it's been a challenging, this piece has been a challenging direction because I'm working with a lot of different artists and I want to get into the artist's head, like what they're thinking, what they're perceiving of the land. A lot of artists that we invite as well have no relationship to South Texas, but have been working already with borderlands and landscapes. And use materials from the land. So they already are familiar with that process. So I think bringing them there, they'll sort of, and it takes time. Like it's not like you're gonna get everything in 1 or 2 weeks or what you're trying to do. And again, everyone's different. Everyone's gonna have a different perspective. I think that's something that I've kind of learned with doing this piece.
And
yeah, I don't know.
It sounds like I mean, it sounds like it takes trial and error as well. I mean, to go
Definitely.
back and maybe this idea that you began with, Angel, which is that it is linked to this idea of a longer duration, that land sculpture and social sculpture, in the sense that Boyce lent to that term. It means that the various parts of each participation are only one part of a longer sort of work in process, ongoing, a sort of ongoingness that you're proposing.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And like I said, I see this like what Tere said, like as a healing as well. So I do see ourselves as sort of these, there's a curator aspect of this work. Curadora, curador, but there's also curandero, right? Like there's these similar words of healing that it's interesting to sort of mesh with and play. And yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I said about having a different perspective on land. I think that's very important. Yeah, and Tere,
Yeah.
We'll see what happens to El Cenote.
No, but I kind of like this idea of, like, for example, the time that the three of us.
That is one good example.
I think Matt.
I
think he's
Yeah,
going
I was
in
just
and
saying
out.
that my connection's kind of bad.
Nice.
Okay, now it's better.
That his work is like a great example of like what we envision for future residents to come down. I mean, our work is like very challenging. It's not something that's easily exhibitable in museum space. It's kind of got like a always in transition aspect to it, which is something that I think is great.
And it stays in the site. Like a lot of the work stay in this in the site, or for example, this Falfurrias. So that's also another thing is, Tere has been working with this photographic processes, but using the landscape as her studio, as her dark room, as a way of presentation as well, rather than like this deliberately like going down there and documenting what is going on, in South Texas, or what is going on in the border. So we try to evade the sort of documenting perspective of this piece as well.
And I think we had to be very aware of how to work in these areas as well, because as a lot of news reporters will come and document and bring like this very fake news about these places. One of the owners of the ranchers says something about this newspaper came into the ranch and write an article about how many immigrants have died in their particular ranch. And what happened is now they're affecting the immigrants in a way, because now the ranchers don't want to help and don't want any water to be in the ranch, they build ladders so they can cross from one fence to another. And now these places, they don't want to participate in that because now the news have advertised their ranches as a place of danger. So in other ways, like we had to be kind of like sensitive about the dialogue that we talk about immigration too, because that can affect the migrants as well. And I think that's something that we have learned through this trial and error when we go there and we talk to people around, because it's not only about, like I said, it's not only about us going there and make work, it's about us being there and being involved as well. Hear the stories about the people, hear the true stories about the people who have experienced who have experienced that.
There's an article that just came out in the Los Angeles Times that's based in Del Rio, but one of the elements that we're beginning to see is the potential of ranchers, to the degree that the asylum seekers and border crossers who cut through their land can very well be the subjects of violence. Many of them are beginning to arm themselves, and I think this is another element is the politics of different ranchers that are not a homogenous identity either in this board game, right? But that's part of it. I think the project is to provide complexity to the pre-established script that the board game has been to date or till now.
We're calling it a board game now.
Yeah,
my fault.
no, because it is.
there's literally games, and what do you call it? The games where they bring exotic animals. There's different ranches that import exotic animals for hunting. Yeah, in that area too. So you have this sort of weird, fauna as well, like in this area. That's just kind of like, it's a very strange space to be in.
It is.
Well, I'm afraid that I must peel away for the moment.
Thank you, Roberto.
No, it's a
thank
pleasure.
You so much for meeting with us.
you,
I know
Roberto.
it's Sunday, and thank you for.
Luego
chatting with
platicamos
us.
sobre McAllen.
Sí,
Oh, yeah.
definitivamente. Tenemos que vernos en McAllen también.
I know. All
Muchas
right, bye,
gracias, Roberto. Un
Roberto.
placer
Thank
hablar
you.
contigo.
Hasta pronto.
Thanks.
Hasta
Hasta
pronto.
pronto.
Bye.
Bye.